Thank you all again for joining us. Just wanted to give one minute or two, so that we can make sure that everyone is allowed to join us. And as a reminder, all of our participants have been placed in a listen only feature. And in order for you to ask questions, we'll describe this a little bit later as we start the session, but there is a box that's noted as Q&A. Please feel free to submit all your questions to the Q&A forum, and we'll be answering those at the end of this session. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is the Office of Diversity and Inclusion's first webinar designed to provide faculty, staff, of course, with some inclusive excellence principles in learning or into this transition to virtual environments. And just a quick note as we get started, closed captioning is unavailable during this live session. I deeply apologize for this. We all apologize for this, but we will make the transcription available after this recording. And again, the closed captioning feature is not available live, but we will make that transcription available to all following the recording of this session. I'll give you all a few minutes, but I would encourage you to please familiarize yourself with the Q&A feature. This is what we'll be using throughout our session to answer your questions. We will dedicate a few minutes after the session to answer some of those questions, and to note that we have received a few of those before the session earlier this week or later this past weekend. But please use the Q&A feature throughout the session to submit those questions. We'll try to answer a few of those as we're going throughout the session live, but we'll dedicate time immediately after this presentation to go through those questions. And for those that we're unable to get to throughout the session, after the session, we will make sure that we make that available to everyone that participated and signed up in the form of an email, which will contain the recording, closed captioning transcription, and then of course the question and answers that were submitted that we were unable to get to throughout the session. So before we begin, I do want to take some time to acknowledge the global impact of COVID-19. As we all know, this has been an unprecedented time in our global history. there seems to be a lot of sentiments that are growing as this virus continues to increase in numbers. We've noted that some states, such as New York, California, Louisiana, are really impacted by this virus, and globally, of course, as we've noted throughout different parts of Western Europe, and of course throughout different parts of Asia, including China and India. The loss of access is immeasurable, but most importantly, the loss of so many lives throughout this. And of course, working directly in higher education, for many of us, we notice that our students are immeasurably impacted. And many of our students are using this opportunity to reflect. There's a real, and that's the loss of the access to friends, this campus community. And it's important to note that as we're noting this is unprecedented, meaning that our students have lost, of course, not just campus community, but many of our seniors are mourning traditions, rituals they will miss, such as graduation, or not just graduation, and not our particular students, but globally, noticing this. And as we're not acknowledging this, I do want to note that for faculty and staff, we have these same worries that many of our students share, but there are also some worries that we have that include the transition to online learning. And how do we support university operations during this period? All of these things are important to remember as we go throughout this session. There's no way that we can put the words throughout that would actually really measure that impact. But I do want to just take this moment to say that above all of this, as the virus continues to spread, and as you worry about the health of ourselves, our loved ones, and our students and staff, there are a few ways that we want to help you guide yourself and students through this crisis. Know that the COVID-19 impacts everyone. We are in a moment now, we're in a period of time that we have to prepare for the unexpected and to expect that unexpected. It's important to start communicating openly with one another, with our loved ones, with our students, and then of course to listen, because these are very real moments right now. It's impacting not only our students' education and our ability to deliver that, but it's impacting our personal, our political, and our global, of course, economies and lives. And as we're transitioning throughout this period, just to know that we are all going through this together, and if we can really look at this as a guide, to know that this impacts us all at this moment, and how can we support one another is the most important element of this, and that here at UNL and at the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, our goal is to continue to offer resources that will be evolving as this virus evolves and as the needs evolve, and that our goal is to continue to provide that support as best and as applicable as possible. And so, of course, this webinar is presented by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the voice you've been hearing for the past few minutes. My name is Nkenji Friday. I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Strategic Initiatives in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I'll allow my colleague, Dr. Combs, to also introduce herself.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. As you can see, my name is Gwendolyn Combs, and I am an Associate Professor of Management in the College of Business at the university, but I'm also working with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion as the Director of Faculty Diversity and Inclusion, looking at issues in terms of search practices, classroom climate, and any issues that faculty would have, or issues related to instructional processes.
Thank you. And of course, as I noted, we are the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Our office is a central office providing vision, leadership, and advocacy, fostering inclusion, of course, equitable outcomes, and a welcoming campus that's central to the land-grant mission of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We lead, we facilitate development of institutional policies, protocols, and practices. And our goal, of course, is to provide all these resources, creating this equitable, inclusive campus culture by following an inclusive excellence framework. And that framework is, of course, what we are utilizing in order to deliver this training, applying these principles to this kind of transition to remote learning. The Office of Diversity and Inclusion is led by Vice Chancellor Marco Barker. He was appointed April 1st, 2019. Dr. Barker will actually be celebrating his first year, or year one, at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln this Wednesday, actually. Just for a quick note, if you want to kind of keep up with our office and kind of understand the work that our Vice Chancellor has been doing thus far, we encourage you to actually access the special report, which marked his first 150 days at UNL. That can be found by visiting the link that's provided. And in case I did not note this, this recording will be made available to all participants, including those that signed up. And we will also provide the resources of all the information that we utilize throughout to all participants as well. So today's webinar, we have a few objectives that we want to kind of, or the agenda items we wanted to introduce, but essentially we'll be first introducing the objectives of this webinar. We want to provide you all with some research or a firmer foundation for the research, and then provide some definitions, because we'll be using these definitions throughout. We also want to help you to kind of confront assumptions, especially as we've now transitioned to this kind of online format and this remote learning, and ways that we can confront those assumptions in order to provide those equitable spaces and principles to guide your classes. And then also provide some information about the importance of setting the tone in these classes in order to really reflect the principles of inclusivity that we'll provide those principles as well. And then we want to end with some inclusive teaching principles, some very practical, easy deliverable elements that faculty can implement in their classes as they've made that transition today being the first day. How do you actually include those principles in the online learning format? And then, of course, as I noted earlier, we will leave time for Q&A. Our goal, of course, with the question and answer session is to get to as many questions as possible throughout. And if we're not able to get to all the questions that were asked throughout the session, we'll make sure to answer those in our follow-up with those resources mentioned earlier. And just as a note, that today's webinar is designed, of course, to draw on some standards of inclusive excellence. We want to provide you these very applicable resources and strategies, but we also want to make sure that we are emphasizing that this is foundational information. The goal of this is to provide some relatively, I should say, easier to implement strategies, but this is just an overview. It's designed to offer foundation. We cannot provide all the information based on, especially these marginalized populations that we were speaking on today, is to give you an overview and to know that in order to do a more deeper or more intensive or inclusive dive here, that will probably require a few more trainings or sessions, but our goal is to provide you with some on-the-ground meat for your classes in order to implement these, especially with this transitioning happening in a relatively short period. So we wanted to offer this as an overview and to encourage those who may want a little bit more information, for those who may want a deeper dive, or to, for example, learn a little bit more about microaggressions and some of those elements we'll introduce today. We encourage you to reach out to our office. We'll provide you the contact information for ways that we could actually develop those sessions based on the needs of our faculty and staff. So with that being said, of course, we will introduce principles of inclusive excellence. These are designed to really impact the online learning experience. We say online learning, but these are also applicable to our face-to-face models. But we're going to emphasize the underrepresented students, low income, students with disabilities, students of color, first-generation college students, and our international students during this period of unprecedented disruption. And it was noted that this, of course, this disruption has impacted all stakeholders. But one thing we do want to emphasize is that there are some communities and some populations that are a little bit more vulnerable due to some systemic areas within our global world and our national landscape. And we want to call these out as a way of making sure that these students are considered as we are developing these formats, and how do we actually apply these principles. So the elements of emphasis during this session will be the communication, connection, engagement, and of course the interaction. And so we'll get started with the first thing. And as we thought about this, we wanted to make sure that we knew the individuals that were involved in this training or in this quick session. So we have a poll that you'll see on the screen in a few seconds. And this poll, everyone should have access. It says, what is your online learning experience? We're going to give you 20 seconds to answer that one question. What is your experience with online learning? Expert, intermediate, or beginner? What is your experience? And it seems that this polling shows us your experience. We have 15% of the individuals considered at the expert level, and then we have 30%, I'm sorry, not 30%, 57% at the intermediate, and then we have 28% perhaps at that beginner level. And the purpose of these polls are to kind of determine where many of our participants are, especially when it comes to this online format. And we have a second poll for you all. You should see that in a few seconds. Poll number 2. What is your role at UNL? And again, 20 seconds for that one. Okay. It seems we have 26% of our participants are faculty, 65% are staff, we have 7% student, and then we have 2% that are considered to be friends of UNL or friends of UNL. Thank you. The purpose of those polls are to just get a pulse of the audience that we are currently delivering this service to. Thank you all so much for that. It seems like that was a relatively easy tool to use. And then, of course, before we get really started, some quick definitions. You'll be hearing these terms a lot, but inclusive excellence and inclusive teaching. So what do we mean when we say inclusive excellence? It should be noted that inclusive excellence is not a relatively new term or terminology, but it is designed to help institutions of higher learning to really integrate DE&I, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, to the educational efforts. When we talk about this, we talk about the missions and even the institutional operations, so all elements, of course, of the institution. It really calls for higher education to address these needs, especially when it's related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as being critical to the well-being of a democratic culture. It's an active and ongoing process. It's something where, especially at UNL, we've started to really experience in many ways. This was introduced, of course, on a larger scale during Vice Chancellor Barker's State of Diversity that was held this past October. And it's a way for really beginning these intentional policies and practices and structures in order for our campus and our policies and practices to really reflect inclusivity. And then, of course, inclusive teaching, which we're talking a little bit about today, is, and we wanted to call out this being a deliberate or intentional. So we're deliberately cultivating a learning environment where all students are treated equitably, that they have this equal access to learning, and they feel welcomed and valued and supported in this learning, in the pursuit of this learning. And it's important to note this means in the regards of what faculty in particular are able to offer. When we say inclusive teaching, there's some parts of this or some elements we may introduce today that may be outside of the realm of the faculty's role or even, of course, ability, and that will have more to do with external factors. And of course, inclusive teaching also includes this need to attend and make sure we're actually seeking the changes. So we talk about attend to social identities, better understanding those, seeking ways to change some systemic inequities, and then of course in adapting our actual learning spaces in order to actually affect the experiences of students in those spaces while influencing course and the curriculum design. It's an intentional and ongoing process. And so when we talk about inclusive excellence, inclusive teaching, these are the elements that we're mentioning and that we mean. And again, this is an evolving and ongoing effort, meaning that we're intentional in all of these pursuits, knowing that when we say continuous and evolving, that it requires practice and ongoing learning for all participants. And with that being said, I'll hand this over to Dr. Combs as we get started.
Okay, thank you all for participating in this webinar. And just very briefly, as Dr. Friday has indicated, we felt that it was important to not assume that positive environments will occur organically as we move from face-to-face teaching, classroom instruction to more remote ways of facilitating learning. So there's a lot of research that has gone into the preparation of our conclusions here and the information that will be presented. So there's some resources provided for you at the end of the webinar, and then there will be additional resources that will be provided on the web page in association with this particular session. But I wanted you to know, just kind of briefly, we've looked at studies in relationship to the sense of belonging on academic and health outcomes for African American students, Latino students. We've looked at positive impacts of student success for first generation and low income and underrepresented college students. We've looked at issues in terms of microaggressions and also the notion of universal design of classroom spaces and instructional spaces. So you'll have an opportunity to peruse some of those links later on, but for the sake of time, we're going to kind of go through the information that's presented here, prepared for you in the webinar, and then allow you hopefully to have substantial time for to ask some questions. But the evidence base that we have for looking at including inclusive excellence in teaching is pretty vast. And so there's research that deals with the relationship of classroom climate and student learning. And most of us know that there are considerable impacts in terms of how students are approached in the classroom, the types of things that are permitted to occur, especially when we get into student engagement or cross-student engagement. But a couple of things I wanted to highlight. The social belonging as a key to student learning and persistence is particularly important. If students don't feel that there is a place for them in their classroom, that they are not able to integrate with their peers in the classroom, then that impedes their ability to be persistent in their learning. Sometimes we will see that some students kind of fade out of the instructional experience over time, and some of those reasons are based on social belonging. Also, the notion of students feeling that their identities matter in the classroom and having to deal with or contend with microaggressions that can impact their learning. And those microaggressions can be intentional or unintentional, as the research indicates. But regardless of the motivation, the outcome and the impact can be the same. So we're looking at also best practices for engaging difficult dialogues in higher education and specifically in the classroom. The fact that we will no longer at UNL through the remainder of this semester have the opportunity to just have eyes on our students, so to speak, that means that we will have to engage some practices that will help us to gain information as to how things are transpiring in the classroom environment, in those project groups, in those discussion boards. So we'll have to pay particular attention to those types of issues. So it's important that we are purposeful in those processes, and we will talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. Next slide. Oh, we have a poll. So if you take about 20 seconds as before to respond to the poll, that would be great. Oh, okay. So very good response for the groups that are on the on the webinar, where you see these types of discussions and the importance of inclusive practices as being very, very important. So 93% of the group on the webinar agree with that statement. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to talk about confronting some assumptions. And if you've been paying attention to current news and individuals who are looking at educational processes in relationship to the ability to have access to technology, which they are terming the digital divide within the United States, and notions of segregation as part of the basis for access, digital literacy, and limitations due to cultural types of indicators. So we know that rural and low-income communities have less access to broadbanding. So therefore, we have to be conscious as we are developing our assignments in remote learning, how we give students the opportunity to be flexible in terms of how they're able to engage the materials in our courses. We also know that students may also be facing other issues such as some homelessness situations, food and financial insecurities, because we know that many persons have lost their jobs. Our students no longer have perhaps their part-time positions that they were able to engage in Lincoln. So as they're home, there may not be opportunities for them to recoup those types of experiences. So we need to be concerned about not only how we engage learning, but also some of the situational issues and constraints that students will be dealing with during this time and dealing with COVID-19. So that means that faculty have to be intentional, have to be flexible. You have to have the opportunity for students to engage the material in a number of different ways. Next slide, please. So in terms of resetting expectations in relationship to the classroom, I know for myself, I'm teaching a class, and I usually have pretty high expectations for students, and in terms of their output and the effort that they put into their learning, how things are done. So we also tend to presume that the students will do certain things. And the first issue here is students, we presume and we assume that students will seek help when they are struggling with a class. That is not necessarily true. There are certain groups, particularly based on gender, where we know males do not have as much of a proclivity to ask for instructions or enhanced directions or explanations as perhaps the women in our classes. We have persons who may not ask for help because of some indications that it might go into areas of stereotype threat for them, where they are afraid to ask for help because they feel that it's going to confirm some particular stereotype about their particular cultural, racial, or ability group. So we have to be careful about that, and to in this environment where we don't have eyes on the students, we're not necessarily seeing them twice a week or once a week. We have to develop ways to let them know that asking for help is expected. Not that it's okay, but it is expected for them to ask for help, and that you are available to help them and to guide them in getting the resources and the information that they need. Also, older students and students with physical disabilities, we have assumptions about their ability to learn, the rate of their learning, the speed of their learning. So we need to be conscious of those types of issues that could creep into the way we are designing our classes remotely, the types of assignments that we provide, and also how we are presuming that students should be able to provide the products that we are asking them for. Then students may have some sensibilities, and do have sensibilities about being presumed that they are the expert and spokesman for their groups. And we know that this creates some feelings of uncomfortableness on the parts of students. And I have seen cases where this particular assumption is made and the students just basically check out of the class. They don't want to be placed in those situations, and instructors and professors need to be conscious of those types of issues. Um, some perceptions that only certain students can be experts or have an opinion about an issue. I know I teach a diversity class, and many times my European American students are reluctant to speak because they have been placed in a position and they have that perception that they are not to have an opinion about certain things. And we have to kind of give them the opportunity to dispel some of those assumptions. And we need to be mindful about those as instructors as we are progressing through the latter parts of this semester. Next slide, please. I'm speeding through this because our time is kind of getting away from us, and we really want you to have opportunity to ask your questions. So setting the tone, several challenges for underrepresented students. This notion of invisibility, not being recognized in the instructional environment, not being considered to have any reasonable answer or response that would be a contribution to the class, accessibility, and the information that I have been reading, the digital divide really impacts underrepresented populations. So where persons who are in lower socioeconomic groups do not have access to all of the devices, iPads and computers, or each person having access to their individual computers. There's maybe a lot of sharing that takes place within that particular household. And then external pressures we've talked about already, where students may be dealing with the fact that their parents have been laid off, or their guardians are no longer employed and relying on other areas, other means to try to provide for the family. So we have to be mindful, like we should be mindful, this is my opinion and opinion of others in the research, of all those external pressures that students might be facing in trying to do the assignments that they have been prescribed. So flexibility and looking at different modes and operations of handling the classroom experience can be extremely important to student success. So looking at expectancies, I don't think that we need to lower our expectations in terms of the learning that we anticipate from students, but we need to look at our expectations in terms of the processes and how we get that accomplished. Building rapport and community is going to be extremely important right now. Our students have been pretty much yanked out of familiar settings in terms of how they receive instruction, and being forced to use some different modalities. So we need to be careful about that and to try to create that rapport between student and instructor, and also across your student population. And so there are some ways that we can do that. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Using inclusive language, acknowledging the differences of individuals, being sure that we know the appropriate language to use as we're referring to specific groups in our classrooms, and helping our students to be aware of how they should be responding in these types of environments in relationship to underrepresented students. Awareness of multiple visible and invisible identities in the classroom. And this can be a huge issue because all identities that can be salient to a student at any particular point in time are not visible. Many of them are invisible identities. Just because I might be African American doesn't mean that that's the only identity that is impacting my learning in the classroom. So as instructors, we need to be mindful that there are multiple identities. There are intersections of identities, and not all identities are visible. Many of them are invisible. So we have to be conscious of that, and to provide some space for students to perhaps in this environment to indicate to us where their issues might be and what might be motivating those issues. Addressing any tensions or problematic patterns of interactions. And here we will have to be particularly vigilant because you can have an individual student who may discontinue participation in a group assignment, and you may not be aware of that. So developing ways to check in on your students. The polling that we've been doing today is an example of a way that you can check in on your students and just ask some very simple questions that can give you information that might be helpful for you in helping the students to learn better. Okay, next slide. You went backwards. Okay, here we go. So there are four principles that we wanted to introduce in terms of inclusive excellence principles in instruction. And those, as you can see, are transparency, academic belonging, accessibility, and flexibility. So you'll be hearing some of these words repeated throughout the presentation, because the research has indicated that they are extremely important in us helping our students, all students, to be successful in our remote learning situations. And they also transfer into situations when we get back into our regular mode of teaching into the classroom setting. But transparency is looking at clear communication. Using a language that is clear, that clearly expresses what the expectations are, provide some examples that explain and show the expectations in action, and to let students know, okay, we're in a different format. These are the ways that I have changed the class and changed the instruction. These are the ways that I perhaps enhance or change the assignments for the class. And here are some ways that I can help you in being successful. Looking at virtual office hours might be helpful, and giving students an opportunity to contact you, and for you more specifically to be available to the students. We've already talked about belonging, but developing those connections related to the course, okay? And be mindful that students will be taking multiple courses now remotely, and so we will have to help them kind of navigate that situation. And then be mindful of accessibility to online instruction for our students at all times. And I have interjected in my class, which is a case-based class, ways that I can check in on students from time to time as a group, as a whole class in their project groups, and then individually to see how well they're doing and if they have any questions or any concerns that I can help them with. And then also, again, being flexible. Being aware that there may be some changes that students present to you that might impact the way that you have to address the class in relationship, or the class materials in relationship to that particular student. And realize that there are a lot of changes that students have experienced. There are a lot of changes that faculty members have experienced, and we just have to be patient with each other during these processes. Next slide, please. All right, so we're using a word here that in a way that might seem a little bit difficult or different in terms of the way it's normally perceived. But we're saying that and asking that we all try to embrace intrusion, all right? To embrace intrusion, meaning that we are not, we're going to take an approach of not sitting back, or we're asking you to consider an approach where you don't just sit back and wait for the student to come to you. Look for ways to fully engage underrepresented students, because we talked about stereotype threat, we talked about the issue of cultural dynamics that may not lead them to come to you if they have concerns about how they're able to access the class, their understanding of a particular assignment, understanding of the changes that you've made in terms of the course and course delivery. So we're asking you to be intrusive. That means take responsibility, be proactive, be intentional in how you look at establishing that class environment for all of your students, but particularly underrepresented students, first-gen students, students with disabilities. So some of the strategies is ask them some questions. And again, this is an example of the polling that we did today, can help you with that. And that polling can be done in Zoom. I think that type of polling can be done in Canvas as well. So if you wanted to do those things and you're not familiar with them, consult your instructional designers on campus and they will be able to walk you through that. But asking them, what concerns do you have about taking this course at this particular point in time, given the changes that have been made? Ask them how you can best facilitate their learning now. I know we probably do these things at the beginning of the semester, but here's an opportunity for us to reset and to do things and to incorporate ways that will help and contribute to student success. All right, next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr. Combs.
Huh?
I said thank you. I'm going to pick it up right here.
Okay, all right.
And as we are talking a little bit about embracing intrusion, some of the things we do want you all to think about as well is how can we actually make our courses more transparent? And we say proactive measures, such as even asking these questions to yourself, but what will it take to be successful in this course? And then answering that question for your students. So essentially, as we're thinking through this, think through how you should approach the readings. Again, as we're talking about access and the ability of our students, we're looking at this differently. We're not assuming what our students may have access to, and what does that experience look like for our students, but understanding that we have to readjust. And even thinking about how students, or how should I approach this study process? How should students prepare for their exams? And as you're thinking through your questions, how do you actually to translate that to your students? As you pose them, perhaps you even want to record yourself and tell students, again, candidly, what will it take to be successful in this course? And then tell them what those expectations are. And then start providing them exact examples on ways they can take and even start to organize their notes, modeling and providing examples of that. A few other things we should think about, using assessment strategies that focus on continuous improvement and progress. This will actually demonstrate the proficiency by the end of the course. And again, readjusting our expectations, because again, many of our students, of course, ourselves included, did not sign up for online classes. So this will be an adjustment period. So use your assessment strategies that focus on the actual improvement process. Adjusting grades be based on the efforts, and also personalizing that feedback. I think many of us know, but studies have shown time after time that when students receive personalized feedback on assignments and on efforts, that has a tendency, obviously, to impact in a positive way. Students want to know that progress. And then, of course, offering alternative course grading options. We're not within our classrooms anymore. Many students have lost that sense of community. So if we can offer those alternatives to our grading, that alleviates many of the stress elements, but also it allows students to actually see, again, the light at the end of the tunnel, and also to see themselves actually modeling and going through the course and growing throughout that. And of course, research has been out plentiful and bountiful at this point, but smaller assignments with lower point totals versus a large assignment with big point totals. So that one assignment that's worth 70% of their grade versus maybe 5 or 6 assignments that will equal up to that amount. So just considering those different ways. Again, we're talking about intrusion because of this major disruption. We want to let students and provide these strategies for them to maximize their potential for success, but notably for those who may have more difficulty just because of external factors and systemic areas that we want to be cognizant of.
Then Kenji, could I just say something about that last piece? Because I know most professors will have, huge end of course assignments, and I have one of those too. But usually those assignments require a lot of collaboration among the students in whatever groups that you have them situated in. And students may not have the accessibility or the opportunity to do that any longer because they're not on campus together and they're not taking other classes together. So to break those up into smaller chunks would be really, really helpful for students.
Thank you. And relational learning. This is another principle that's going to connect back to that accessibility and community building, but relational learning really examines a way of being students from a social constructionist perspective. So we are actually looking at this, modeling this for students, mentors, and professors, and we're learning from one another. And this is something that, especially when we're talking about universal design through this kind of online learning format, and actually applying these principles of our own experiences and our own ideas with the actual elements of that course. And this is actually inviting both the students and the instructors to enter into this kind of pact or a dialogue about their own learning. And it really intentionally kind of rejects this deficit perspective. So we're not looking at our students based on some, it could be stereotypical or these general kind of observations that we think we have about their intellectual capacities or their fit for college. But we are more so looking at this as validation, positive messaging. We are actually providing actual ways our students can see themselves finishing this course successfully, and we're engaging them in the learning process. And as Dr. Cont said earlier, these high expectations are still something that we hold dear. We are pushing our students, of course, to excel, holding them, of course, to this standard. But we're also providing kind of this unconditional positive message, and that can be done in so many different ways. Many of you have seen probably through the Center for Transformative Teaching, which we'll talk about as we end this, but there's just different elements to actually start this instruction of courses. So if you're recording messages, for example, perhaps you could start off your recorded weekly session meeting with just this notion of how you are doing, and also encouraging your students to push through and giving them strategies. If you've had some type of graded work, perhaps putting on their actual assignment, you belong here, proud of you, you can exceed. Again, just reinforcing these positive messages and relating to their experiences. We are in this part right now together, and our students, more so than any of these stakeholders, are having a loss of community, and they're not as connected. Many of them may not be as connected to the materials they were a few weeks ago. So we reinforce their sense of belonging through these kind of positive regards. We can really start to impact not only their sense of belonging, but to start structuring their participation in a more collaborative effort. And how does this relational learning look? I provided a few examples, but at its core, of course, relational learning relies heavily on strong relationships between the instructor and the student, a working alliance, a collaboration, and it's rather than setting up this dynamic based on power, we're looking at ourselves as a trusted guide. The disruption to your actual courses has been, of course, immeasurable, and we can use this opportunity, especially as we transition to the online learning component, to really look at this as a collaborative effort with our students. We are, many of us in a sense, we're working through this together, not just the pandemic, but the disruption of it. So instead of us looking at the more traditional settings, we can start acting as guides. To note, many of our students have lost that sense of community. So many times you may see that your students in your classes may look to you to be the guide, not only for that course, but for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln itself, because you are the connection they'll have to the institution. And even though they've probably established relationships with many different areas on campus, many of them will start coming to their faculty as a trusted source for that information and to kind of guide them through this process. And we can use this as an opportunity for the learning process as well. And of course, start to transform this as a working alliance that will be central not only to their experiences in this course, but the broader educational experience. So bonding over this particular, of course, moment, but also the course, and then again, your possibility of being placed in the center of their experiences at this point. And then of course, you're the master of this field, but also letting students be involved in the process of that. We're going to talk a little bit about the dialogues in courses, depending on, of course, the format of your class. But in many times, of course, given where we are, especially with the pandemic, we want to start talking about ways we can meet this opposition. And it can be in many forms, because again, a lot of our students may be very afraid what's happening right now. How do we meet that, especially dispelling myths and perhaps even discrimination and biases? How do we meet that with civil discourse? And then even allowing ourselves, and especially as faculty, a moment of vulnerability so students can see, again, that the impact of this pandemic, but also this transition has its impact on all of us. And again, it goes back to that connecting and being a part of the guide. And it's part of that to really establish the dynamic for students to begin understanding their role and yours in this learning process, especially with the disruption to the online learning format. The third principle is to build community. Building community in the online environment, it highly increases, of course, the likelihood of student success. Online learning is not a new phenomenon, but it will be new to many of our students and perhaps to many of us. And in order to create a sense of community to really impact the likelihood of that student success, we want to provide you a few strategies that will focus on continuous improvement and progress. So we talked a little bit about grade based on feedback, personalizing this, of course, as much as possible, but we also want you to be deliberate and consistent with the building of communities, helping students connect not only with the course material, but with one another. This is something that's quite simple, it seems, especially when we have the face-to-face model, building the community. Students, again, there's the physical aspect of being in the same room as one another. They're sharing the learning experience together in real time at the same time. But it's a little bit different when you're in an online environment. So we have to be a lot more creative and intentional with how we build this community. And in many ways, we can do that with very simple strategies. We want you to think about being present in some aspects of the course. Of course, I mean, one of the things we do recommend, especially talk about synchronous versus asynchronous, is that in order for this to be as successful to our students as possible, we don't want to set up additional barriers by having students meet at the same time, etc. We want to be able to be flexible with that regard as we're able to be. But perhaps as we're thinking about these videos, introducing your own current status, it could be a short video that you upload to your Canvas site, and you can invite students that may want to participate as well. UNL the University Communications Department just released this great video that you may have seen or may not have seen yesterday, where many members of the campus are kind of giving these virtual high fives, and it's maybe 20 members. It's something that is a way of connecting, again, remaining connected with the students, but to show them that we're in this together. And it's a fun way, of course, to engage them. But we can also kind of detail in our videos ways that you yourself may be staying busy, observing things that you've seen throughout, perhaps even talking about the opportunity to engage maybe in your own particular discipline a little bit more, or TV shows. Any way you can kind of, again, build a community with your students, because there's a real sense of loss, especially at this moment. And you can also be active in your classroom discussions. If you're going to set up classroom discussion boards, group chats, forums, igniting those conversations is important, but engaging in them continuously is as well. Making sure you're commenting on student dialogue, participating as well. It's showing students that this is an active, ongoing process. And again, you're building intentional relationships as well. Other opportunities to engage outside the classroom, perhaps thinking about setting up virtual groups, study groups. It can also be virtual meetups. Many different areas have now had these kind of virtual happy hours or mocktails over online. So just different things such as that. But being intentional with that, especially looking at our underrepresented students who, again, I keep saying, but they have had a real sense of loss, and especially for those who may be historically underserved, we want to be as intentional as possible. And then finally, perhaps sharing perspectives. Inviting students to share their stories with other students, creating a community of scholars. And again, it does not have to be personal related stories, but it could be more so about their experiences right now, their expectations for the course, or just even some suggestions they may have in implementing more structures of support for one another. And our final one is the culturally relevant and affirming principle, which connects back to the flexibility and the critically engaging differences piece. But the culturally relevant and affirming approach includes running classrooms that are reflective of a diverse society. Many times, instructors, of course, serve as the classroom manager. They set the tone. They also really help with crafting the climate. And it's important to recognize our own biases and values and how they can be reflected and influence our own particular expectations for behaviors of students and the interactions our students may have with one another. And part of this is to start really being intentional about strategy that we employ, especially in the online environment, that we can simply implement to really start to affirm the multicultural components of our course, of our classes, and also, of course, of the diverse and global world that we of course, serve. So a few strategies that we developed are selecting some literature or your readings that are inclusive of multiple voices. So we can, of course, include various religions. We can include international perspectives. We can also include different authors, especially when we're talking about examples, providing concrete individuals that may be, again, different from the majority voice. Just providing those like literature reads can really make a difference. And then, of course, even course images as we're developing our course materials, and it could be the visuals, making sure that they reflect, again, a diverse society. So they should reflect students of color. They should reflect the disabilities, the various disabilities our students may or may not have. And then, of course, diversity in multiple forms. So even in regards to kind of these images, it could be a slideshow that you've developed. And of course, even when we're speaking during our course recordings, or we're doing these sessions with our students, when we're providing examples, make sure that your examples are cemented in diversity. Even the name selection, if you're trying to think of different names. I used to do this in courses all the time where I say, so example, I talked to a woman, Keisha. Keisha was, etc. Giving different perspectives, names, and pronouns, things like this are very important. You're mirroring what you want your students to see, because that's what currently exists. When we do this, we accept, of course, what we see, but we also invite in multiple perspectives and our students without it being a forced regard. And of course, exposing students to racially salient images that highlight their contributions to society. So we are showing these examples. They are positive images, they are positive examples, and they are diverse in their scope. And although participants play a role, many participants play a role in the course, the faculty member's role is central, especially in the forming of the climate for diversity. You have the power to select the course content, the discussion, and of course, you facilitate the learning. And all of this, of course, impacts and affects the classroom climate. So is your language inclusive? It's important to use the pronoun she just as much as he. And of course, even gender neutral pronouns are equally important. So as we're doing that, we want to make sure we're modeling it and we're not relying heavily on like these masculine terminologies. And we also, of course, want to make sure we're not making assumptions. And also when you're lecturing, if you're using phrases such as, it's easy to see, or I'm sure this answer is obvious to most of you all. We don't want to avoid those kind of phrases because one, we don't want to assume that it is easy to see. And we also want to make sure that we're allowing room for growth and development. And of course, preparing yourself to address diversity issues in classroom discussions. Don't assume that your discipline is immune to this. And we also want to make sure we're being mindful of outdated terms for social groups. And give feedback, of course. We noticed this already, but it includes praise. And we encourage you to expose yourself to the research on microaggressions. So for example, there's Sean Harper's Racial Justice Institute. We're going to offer a few more, especially in terms of our resource page. But make sure that you're staying present in the online dialogue, monitoring it regularly, and intervening as you need to and as necessary. And of course, final thoughts. As this coronavirus crisis escalates, faculty members across the country have been rushing to retool their courses. There is an emotional and a physical and psychological toll that this takes. That not only we see, of course, when we're transitioning to this online or remote learning, but it's also brought on by the global pandemic. To integrate empathy and compassion into our courses is critical. If nothing else we have said today is important, this is quite important. We are at a very unprecedented period in our history, and when we show more empathy and compassion, we can transform our classes, but we can also show our students that we are with them in this regard and that we also care about their overall well-being. So a few things to consider. Think about the new challenges your students are facing. We're going to provide you with a lot of literature and a lot of resources following this, but the actual obstacles that many of them will face, which are likely to be access, but also external factors that we cannot always see, we want to make sure we're creating a variety of pathways for students to complete their assignments. This is crucial. Our students are investing their time and efforts in this, and we want to make sure that we understand that there's so many invisible challenges or just not visible to us that our students will be facing and that they continuously face. And out of all this, we're making so many assumptions. One of the biggest ones that our students would have the basic needs to access. And so we also want to make sure that we're making a habit to assume good intentions, specifically during this period, to embrace that flexibility, to know that our students, again, our students many times have these invisible markers, but as states are still grappling with these, of course, this issue of the global pandemic, know that many of our students are international and many of them may be displaced. We're thinking through all of that, so we want to exhibit grace to our students, but also to ourselves, because this period is not one that we could actually reach back in history to provide us with a path of how to move forward, but more so to actually start thinking through and knowing that this is fluid, that this will change, and that our goal is to make sure we're equipping ourselves and our students with the best tools to be successful. And of course, to know that the Office of Diversity and Inclusion is here throughout to provide these resources and to offer as much support as our structure allows, and that this training or this session is one that we developed in order to answer those very much, I should say, those more immediate concerns, but that we would love to, of course, to continue this conversation as we see the need, because there will be issues or instances that we may not have covered, unfortunately, because this is a general overview. But if you have those concerns or those questions, we do invite you, of course, to reach out to our office. And at this point, we want to leave some space. I know we ran a little bit over because we started a few minutes late to give time for people to arrive for the question and answer session. And to note that we did receive a few questions before we started the session, and I can read off a few of those. To note, we did receive quite a few questions. Our goal will be to answer all of the questions, including the questions with our responses by tomorrow. But the first question we saw was how to support LGBTQA+ students who are returning to homes that may not be accepting. One of the things that I would encourage you, especially during this period where many of our students, including students from our LGBTQA+ communities, would be to know the resources that exist for our students. We are working remotely, but these services, these individuals still exist. I would encourage you to point our students to individuals. It really helps for us to personalize the services that we have to our students. So for example, I would recommend Pat. Her office is still fully functional. We'll provide this information directly after the session. But if you visit their website, of course, the LGBTQA Center website, you can access their information. But they are still working remotely, answering questions and providing the support that they've offered to our students. But I would start there. But I would also, again, depending on your role at this institution, thinking through ways to really personalize your own comfort in supporting the students, and then of course providing them with the names of individuals they can contact, not just for those resources, because many of our students are returning to places that may not be welcoming or accepting. We want to make sure we kind of connect and personalize those elements. Another question that we received was, is there a way a student can file complaints, concerns if their course does not accommodate for certain students? I am worried that one of my professors would not be understanding of my situation at home. I'm sure I speak for many other students as well. And one of the things that our office is currently doing, I noted that we are actually developing resources, but one of the things we will do, especially for this question in particular, is provide a response to all the attendees, but also encourage those who have questions to reach out to our office directly so we can connect you with the individuals. And for that regard, we are working diligently to provide some resources, in particular because, again, we have noted that the rise of the COVID-19 virus, and we've also noted the rise of bias incidents regarding, especially in connection to certain populations, certain identities.
And Kenji, for that question, also individuals can also contact their department chairs or their deans. That is a section that is on pretty much all syllabi, should be reflected on all syllabi. And if there's something that a student has with a particular course that way, then that's also another option.
Thank you. Another question we received, if there is any financial support to low-income students who don't have means to have internet service at home and or do not own a laptop or computer. Yes, we'll actually provide those. There'll be quite a bit of information that we'll have on our own website as well, the University office, but we can provide you with some information, especially in terms of what is being offered through the Office of Student Affairs. And then, of course, there are some internet providers that we have some information on. And then, of course, with our Husker Tech as well, some information there. So we do have some information for you. It's a rather lengthy kind of response, but essentially we'll provide that information when we send this information out for the presentation. Will professors have a system where students who need additional help can submit a request to do so? I'll let you answer, Dr. Combs.
You kind of faded out on the question. Can you repeat it for me?
Yes. Will professors have a system where students who need additional help can submit a request to do so?
I'm not aware of any specific system, but I know that from my experience with the information that was provided to professors in the colleges, we were encouraged to do everything that we could to help students not only be successful in terms of our course, but if there were other issues that they were experiencing, to also be very vigilant and help students find the answers and responses they needed to those other outside questions. So I would say, if you feel that you can start first with your instructor, then I am of the opinion that professors will be very much willing to help students get whatever answers they need.
Thank you. If there are no questions, I'm just making sure. Did we have any other questions, perhaps, Jerry, that we saw?
There are no questions in the question and answer box. We did have a comment and a suggestion that should be available to all participants to see right now.
No.
Thank you. And there was a question here, how do you include those polls? Those were excellent. Thank you so much. We actually, one thing we would recommend, especially as you are working directly with Zoom, is there are a lot of features here that you can actually work. If you go to the help section, our IT department through the Center for Transformative Teaching also has some information that are embedded on the website, Keep Teaching, which I should say is going to be a part of the resources that we're providing at the end. So this page that you see here, you can access a lot of this information, including ways you can create some, let's say, some very much easily accessible assessments in your own online learning tools.
We might add to that, hopefully, I think we talked about this, and Kenji provides some information about some of the hacking that's going on for Zoom sessions now, and ways to help faculty members if you're having group chats or full class Zoom meetings, so that you don't have intruders entering into that space.
Absolutely. Yesterday, the university actually released some information on ways to encrypt and make your recordings, your Zoom sessions more secure, because there have been instances where there have been some hacking, etc. So we will provide the link to that story and some of the resources to make sure that you're encrypting and you're staying safe in your own particular virtual learning environments or your recordings. And to note that the PowerPoint, including the resources, will be sent to everyone, including we're going to have some additional resources that we've developed, including, again, the transcription. And we'll send it out to everyone by the end of the day tomorrow. One final thought, as we're thinking through this, the university has developed a COVID-19 page where there is up-to-date information, in particular for faculty, staff, and students. please make sure that you're directing your students to certain resources so they can stay up to date, and making sure that as you're thinking through this learning environment, of ways that you can continuously send information to our office, which you can connect to. Of course, I'll give the final information at the last part of this session, but you can send us recommendations, questions, ways that we can better, of course, include our information and our resources, and we can update those as needed. Our office will also have a dedicated space on our website, which will be all this information we've presented, but also the Center for Transformative Teaching will have some tips and tools that we've developed, which will really answer some of those questions and allow you to kind of go at your own pace to read through and address those needs that you may have in your own respective classes. And I do want to thank the Center for Transformative Teaching, which has played a pivotal role in us developing some of these resources. That page will send out to you all. It'll be live. Should be live a little bit later today, but our page will be live with the resources for faculty, staff, and students to access, but notably for faculty as they're designing and implementing those elements in their courses. And I do want to make sure that I'm leaving space for our Vice Chancellor. I think he may have wanted to pose something a little earlier.
You had a question, like a clarification. I think about one of the questions, whether the polling is an option in the Zoom meeting, and Jerry has answered and said, yes, it is. Yeah. So if they wanted to do the type of polling that was done today, they can do that in Zoom. It's an option.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for attending. Again, this entire slideshow, the deck, and the resources, and a few other elements will be included and sent to all participants and those that signed up. Even if you were not able to join us today, we'll send that information out. But please make sure you send suggestions and any type of information to diversity@unl.edu. Again, that's diversity@unl.edu. We also ask that you subscribe to our monthly newsletter. It's sent out at the end of each month, and that's diversity.unl.edu and /signup.signup. So please subscribe to our newsletter. Our final feature, we'll be receiving information about this, and of course, our webpage will be updated to include all the information we've spoken on today, including that resource page, which special thanks to the Center for Transformative Teaching, led by Dr. Nick Monk, who's helped us to really develop the training, but also the resources for our faculty during this period. So thank you all so very much.
And Kenji, would you also encourage, I can encourage, and that I'm speaking, if there are things that were missed in this presentation that are particularly pertinent to faculty, staff, or students as we are dealing with remote facilitation, I would appreciate, I'm sure the office would appreciate receiving those comments as well.
Yes, thank you so much. If nothing else, thank you all again for attending. Please reach out to us with any suggestions, feedback, and we will be sending all this information to all signups and participants by the end of the day tomorrow. Any suggestions or comments and feedback, diversity@unl.edu. We wish you the best of luck in your classes. We hope that you take these principles and, of course, apply them as needed. And if you have suggestions for future webinars or information, please let us know. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. Bye.